I was standing on my tiptoes in my father's home office trying to reach his router when my left shoulder flared with the familiar burning ache of my autoimmune disease. I lowered my arm to catch my breath, leaning against the edge of his walnut desk. That is when my eyes fell on the heavy ivory paper resting dead center on his blotter. It was a legal document illuminated by the focused beam of a brass desk lamp. I saw my own name printed in bold ink. It was the supplemental needs trust my grandmother had built to keep me alive. I leaned in expecting to see a routine tax form. As a data scientist, my brain is trained to scan blocks of information and isolate the anomaly. I found the anomaly on page 3. It was a newly notarized amendment. My father had taken a pen and legally struck out the medical research charity my grandmother had named as the contingent beneficiary. In its place, he had typed his own name. The clause was simple and terrifying. Upon my death, the remaining funds would be distributed outright and free of trust to David Harrison. He was the trustee. He controlled the purse strings for my medical care, and he had just legally incentivized my death to the tune of $320,000. A normal daughter might have screamed. She might have snatched the papers, stormed downstairs to the kitchen where he was pouring wine, and demanded to know why her father was planning to profit from her funeral. But tears are just inefficient data processing, and anger without leverage is just noise. I did not scream. What he did not know as I silently photographed every single page, capturing the raised notary seal and sliding the document back into the exact position I found it was, that he had not just signed a windfall. He had handed a data scientist the exact coordinates to dismantle his life. Welcome back to Orange Vengeance, where we tell the quiet stories of women who turn their silence into strategy. If you have ever been treated like a burden by the people who were supposed to protect you, drop a comment with your age and tell me you are still standing. Subscribe to the channel because the way this father gets outplayed is a lesson you will want to remember. My name is Clara Harrison, and I am 29 years old. I live in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. We are a state defined by fierce winters, deep community care, and world-class medical networks. Up here, if you have a sick child, the neighborhood shovels your driveway and brings you hot meals. In this culture, exploiting a vulnerable family member is not just bad manners. In our courts, it is a profound moral failure with unforgiving legal consequences. My father built his entire social identity on this culture. To the neighborhood, to his Rotary Club, to the clinical staff at the hospital. David was the noble, sacrificing caretaker holding his sick daughter together. The reality was much colder. I manage my own career analyzing predictive models for a logistics firm. I own my own townhouse in St. Paul. I manage my own complex medical regimen. But my chronic illness requires specialized expensive infusions that insurance frequently decides to reject. My grandmother knew this, so she set up the trust as a safety net locked tight and meant only for medical emergencies. For 3 years, my father had used my illness as a social prop. He would insist on driving me to specialist appointments I could easily drive myself to. He would bring expensive coffees to the nursing staff, shake the doctor's hand, and speak over me to detail how exhausted he was from managing my care. He harvested sympathy from my pain like it was a cash crop. I let him do it because confronting him cost energy my immune system did not have to spare. I thought his narcissism was a harmless annoyance. I thought the worst he was doing was stealing the spotlight in a sterile exam room. Standing in his dark office looking at the digital photos of his betrayal glowing on my phone screen, I realized how wrong I was. He was not just stealing the spotlight. He was building a financial runway for his future paved over my grave. I locked my phone, slipped it into my pocket, and reached up to plug his router back in. A row of green lights blinked to life. I walked down the oak staircase. He was humming a jazz tune at the kitchen island, swirling his wine in the warm light. He asked if the internet was fixed. I smiled the flat practice smile I use for corrupted datasets, told him yes, and walked out the front door into the freezing snow. I had a lot of work to do. The heater in my car fought a losing battle against the December air as I drove south toward my townhouse. Minnesota winters do not just chill you, they test your structural integrity. The frost seeps through the door seams and settles into your bones. I drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel, the digital photographs of my father's desk burning a hole in my pocket. Our state identity in Minnesota is built around surviving the frost together. We take immense pride in our social fabric. We are the home of the Mayo Clinic ecosystem, a sprawling world-renowned beacon of medical innovation. Our local economy, our culture, and our social values are inextricably intertwined with the business of healing. Because of this deep-rooted medical heritage, our state legislature has established some of the most rigorous and unforgiving fiduciary laws in the country to protect patients and dependents. In this progressive, compassionate environment, a trustee is bound by a strict, unyielding duty of loyalty. To exploit a vulnerable, disabled family member here is not just an act of greed. It is considered a profound moral transgression. The courts pursue self-dealing with swift severity. My father knew all of this. He worked in commercial real estate. He understood contracts, liability, and the law. He simply calculated that his sick daughter would never look close enough to catch him. My grandmother Martha built the Callaway Supplemental Needs Trust when I was 19. I was a sophomore in college when my immune system launched its first real attack on my joints and organs. The hospital bills piled up faster than the snowbanks on Interstate 94. Martha was a pragmatic woman who understood that love is comforting, but liquid capital is what keeps you alive. She funded the trust with $320,000, strictly earmarked for medical emergencies, biologic infusions, and out-of-pocket care. She structured it to be an impenetrable fortress against a healthcare system designed to bankrupt the sick. David was named trustee because on paper he looked the part of a responsible, upstanding father. But Martha installed the State Medical Research Institute as the contingent beneficiary for a very specific reason. She wanted to ensure no family member ever had a financial motive to withhold my care or wish for my passing. The language of the original trust was a protective embrace written in sterile legalese. It mandated that my comfort and medical stability were the sole priorities of the fund. By erasing the medical charity and inserting his own name, David had not just broken the law. He had desecrated a grandmother's final wish. I thought about my father sitting in his warm kitchen drinking his expensive red wine while I fixed his router. For years I had watched him cultivate a public persona centered entirely around my illness. He built a social empire on my diagnosis. Just last summer at our neighborhood block party, I watched him hold court near the grill. A neighbor, a sweet woman named Diane, asked how I was doing. I was standing 10 feet away, perfectly capable of answering for myself. David stepped in front of me, lowered his voice to a somber theatrical octave, and talked about the sleepless nights he spent worrying about my flare-ups. He talked about the heavy toll of managing my specialists. He accepted a plate of brisket with the weary grace of a war hero returning from the front lines. Diane looked at him with shining, sympathetic eyes. I stood there holding my own plate, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. He traded my pain for social currency. He collected their pity, their casseroles, and their admiration, all while I scheduled my own appointments and paid my own copays out of my salary. He played the sacrificing noble caretaker to the community, reaping the rewards of public martyrdom. As I drove down the icy highway, the cognitive dissonance was staggering. The man who wept openly at church fundraisers about the fragility of his daughter was the exact same man who had calculated the dollar value of her absence. A trust document does not rewrite itself. A notary requires a scheduled appointment. The modification was intentional, premeditated, and executed with cold precision. He had to sit in a leather chair across from a legal professional and actively redirect my safety net into his own pockets. The contrast between his public face and his private financial predation was sharp enough to cut glass. I mapped the variables in my head. How does an analytical mind process this level of betrayal? You strip away the emotion and look at the raw data. The data told me that my father viewed me as a depreciating asset with a fixed payout at the end. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The silence of the car wrapped around me. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos again. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin. Tomorrow I had a scheduled checkup with my rheumatologist. David had already texted me twice that week insisting he drive me. He claimed the roads were too slick and that I needed an extra set of ears in the room to help process the doctor's instructions. For years I had viewed his overbearing presence in those exam rooms as an irritating but harmless performance. Now the context had shifted entirely. He was not just playing the martyr for the nursing staff. He was managing his investment. If he stood to inherit the trust upon my death, it was suddenly in his best interest to ensure the official medical record reflected a failing, highly dependent patient. He needed the narrative of my decline to justify his eventual inheritance and maintain control over the funds. He needed me to look sick, act sick, and remain documented as sick. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the quiet warmth of my home. I hung up my winter coat. I did not text him back. Instead, I walked into my own home office, opened my laptop, and began building a secure, encrypted folder on a remote server. The first files I uploaded were the high-resolution photos of his desk. The next files would be my own comprehensive medical records. He wanted to play the concerned, hovering father tomorrow at the clinic. I was going to let him perform. But the stage was no longer his to direct. The curtain was rising on a very different kind of operation, and he had no idea he was already standing on the trap door. The morning air was a brittle 10 degrees when my father parked his SUV in my driveway. I watched the exhaust plume billow in the rearview mirror as I navigated the icy front steps. He had insisted on driving me to the rheumatology clinic. His text at 6 a.m. stated that the roads were treacherous, and I needed to conserve my energy for the examination. I climbed into the passenger seat. The leather was heated. A thermal travel mug of green tea sat in the cup holder waiting for me. To an outside observer, it was a picture of devoted paternal care. To a data scientist holding mental photographs of a rewritten trust document, the heated seat felt like a holding cell. We drove toward the sprawling medical campus in silence. Minnesota takes its healthcare infrastructure seriously. The buildings are towering monoliths of glass and steel designed to project authority and healing. Walking through those sliding double doors usually brought me a sense of relief. Today, the sterile scent of antiseptic and floor wax just heightened my pulse. I treated the rising adrenaline the way I treat a system error. I acknowledged the alert, quarantined the emotion, and focused on the objective. David was in his element the moment we crossed the threshold. He walked with the brisk, purposeful stride of a man who owned the building. We bypassed the main waiting area and headed straight for the specialized infusion wing. The nurses at the central station looked up, and their faces broke into genuine welcoming smiles. My father did not just bring them greetings. He brought bribes disguised as gratitude. He set a cardboard carrier on the high counter. It held 4 large cups from a boutique roaster in the warehouse district, the kind of place that charges $7 for a pour-over and sources beans from single-origin farms. He remembered exactly how the head nurse took her oat milk latte. He handed a dark roast to the scheduling coordinator. He leaned against the counter asking about their children, their holiday plans, and their weekend snowmobile trips. He traded caffeine for their unwavering loyalty. He was securing their goodwill, ensuring that whenever Clara Harrison was mentioned, the staff pictured the tireless, generous father, rather than the capable adult patient. I stood 2 steps behind him watching the transaction. He was securing the perimeter of his narrative. Dr. Linnaeus walked into the exam room 15 minutes later. He was a brilliant, overworked specialist who relied heavily on patient self-reporting to adjust biologic dosages. Before I could even answer his opening question about my joint stiffness, my father shifted in his plastic guest chair and took control of the airspace. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his brow furrowed with practiced concern. He told the doctor that it had been a very rough month. He described a fatigue that supposedly kept me bedridden for days. He casually mentioned that my mobility was declining, painting a picture of a woman losing her grip on independence. He used phrases like struggling to manage daily tasks and requiring constant supervision. I sat on the crinkling paper of the exam table and listened to my father construct a fictional decline. The realization crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. This was not mere overparenting. This was active, premeditated medical gaslighting. The trust he stood to inherit was meant for a vulnerable, dependent beneficiary. If I proved capable of living a long, autonomous life, the funds would remain locked away for decades. He needed the official clinical chart to reflect a failing body. He was planting seeds in my medical record, ensuring that any future auditor or fiduciary board would see a tragic downward trajectory, one that required his permanent financial stewardship. Dr. Linnaeus typed diligently into his tablet, his expression grave. He looked up, adjusting his glasses, and suggested we might need to increase the frequency of my steroid injections to combat this reported deterioration. He was prescribing medicine based on a ghost story. I uncrossed my legs and sat up straighter. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I did not raise my voice or show a fraction of the betrayal freezing my blood. I spoke in the crisp, modulated tone I use when presenting quarterly analytics to a boardroom of executives. I informed the doctor that the fatigue narrative was inaccurate. I opened a spreadsheet I had been maintaining since my diagnosis. I read the raw data aloud. My morning stiffness had decreased by 40% over the last 6 weeks. My inflammatory markers from the previous blood draw were the lowest they had been in a year. I detailed my daily step count, which had steadily climbed, and noted that I had not missed a single day of work or required any mobility aids during the recent cold snap. I handed the tablet to the specialist so he could view the visualized scatter plots tracking my symptom severity. The numbers were irrefutable. Data does not seek pity. It only presents reality. Dr. Linnaeus stopped typing. He looked at my charts, tracing the downward trend of my inflammation spikes. A look of professional relief washed over his face. He nodded, tapping the screen, and agreed that the current protocol was highly effective. He canceled the suggestion for additional steroids and praised my meticulous tracking. I turned my head slowly and looked at my father. The benevolent caretaker mask had slipped just for a fraction of a second. David was staring at my tablet. The muscles along his jawline pulled taut, flexing under his skin. His eyes were cold, assessing the sudden loss of control over the room. He had brought the boutique coffee and played the weary martyr, but he could not argue with a time-stamped spreadsheet. He caught me watching him. The recovery was instantaneous. The tight jaw relaxed into a wide, paternal smile. He let out a hearty chuckle, shaking his head as if he were just a foolish, overly anxious parent. He told the doctor he was simply relieved to hear the good news, claiming his protective instincts must have skewed his perception. He reached over and patted my knee, a gesture meant to look affectionate, but that felt like a localized threat. I did not flinch. I let his hand rest there while I maintained eye contact. He knew that I knew. The first shot had been fired in a sterile fluorescent lit room in Minnesota. I was no longer the obedient, tragic patient he could leverage for a payout. I was a hostile variable he could not control. The ride back to St. Paul was suffocatingly quiet. The snow began to fall again, thick, heavy flakes piling onto the windshield. David kept his eyes fixed on the icy road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white. He turned the jazz station up a few notches, filling the silence with erratic saxophone notes. I looked out the passenger window, watching the frozen lakes roll by, calculating my next move. The medical front was secured, but the financial architecture of his scheme was still intact. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The screen illuminated with a text from my older sister, Harper. It was a reminder about Sunday dinner at our father's house. Harper rarely initiated family gatherings unless she needed an audience or a bailout. She ran a lifestyle brand that sold overpriced mindfulness journals and linen aprons, an enterprise that was perpetually teetering on the edge of insolvency. The text demanded we all be there promptly at 6, because she had something vital to discuss regarding the future of her business. I slid the phone back into my pocket. My father's jaw was still set like stone as he navigated a slippery exit ramp. The pieces were starting to align on the board. He had rewritten my trust to secure a windfall, and his favorite daughter was suddenly summoning the family to announce a financial crisis. The math was not difficult to compile. I closed my eyes and listened to the tires crunch over the salted asphalt, readying myself for the Sunday dinner, where the real extortion would begin. The Sunday dinner tradition at my father's house was an institution built on roasted cedar plank salmon and unspoken hierarchies. I arrived right at 6. The driveway was already occupied by my older sister's pristine white luxury SUV. Harper is 32 years old and embodies a very specific archetype of modern entitlement. She runs a boutique lifestyle brand that sells oversized linen aprons, imported beeswax candles, and leather-bound mindfulness journals to affluent suburbanites. On social media, her life is an endless scroll of soft-focus aesthetics and curated authenticity. In reality, her business model is a logistical nightmare with a negative profit margin. Harper has always been the golden child of our family architecture, while my chronic illness rendered me a medical liability. In my father's eyes, Harper was his shining investment. He funded her undergraduate degree, paid off her early credit card debts, and provided the initial seed capital for her boutique. She was the healthy, vibrant daughter he could brag about at the country club, the one whose success reflected his own supposed brilliance. I walked through the front door, slipping my boots off on the heated tile of the mudroom. The scent of garlic and roasting fish filled the air. I found them in the kitchen. Harper was perched on a leather bar stool, gripping a crystal wine glass so tightly her knuckles were white. She wore a beige cashmere sweater that cost more than my monthly car payment. Her eyes were red-rimmed. The ambient tension in the room was thick enough to measure. My father was at the stove, tending to the salmon, offering soothing murmurs while pouring her another generous measure of Pinot Noir. We moved to the formal dining room. The table was set with heavy silver and cloth napkins. I took my usual seat. Harper barely touched her food. Her leg bounced under the mahogany table, sending rhythmic, anxious vibrations through the floorboards. As a data scientist, I read human behavior as a series of inputs and outputs. The rapid blinking, the untouched food, the heavy drinking. These were the precursors to a systemic collapse. Harper was preparing to launch a crisis, and she needed the right audience. The breakdown occurred right after my father poured the remaining wine. Harper set her fork down with a sharp clatter. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and let out a fractured sob. It was a practice performance calibrated to elicit maximum paternal rescue. She confessed that her boutique was drowning. Her suppliers were demanding upfront payments. Her holiday inventory was trapped in a warehouse due to unpaid freight invoices, and her commercial landlord had just served her with a final notice of default. She looked across the table, tears streaming down her flawless makeup. She named the exact figure required to keep her vanity project alive. $80,000. She needed a cash injection within 2 weeks, or the bank would seize her storefront and liquidate her assets. I sliced a piece of salmon, brought it to my mouth, and chewed slowly. I watched my father. A normal parent facing a sudden demand for nearly $100,000 might express shock, anger, or at least financial hesitation. David did not flinch. He did not ask to see her balance sheets or question her unsustainable overhead. Instead, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers in a gesture of profound patriarchal reassurance. He told her to take a deep breath. He smiled his benevolent community pillar smile. He promised her that they would figure it out. Then he delivered the sentence that brought the entire puzzle into sharp, terrifying focus. He said he was currently looking into restructuring some family assets and that he could likely free up the necessary capital to save her storefront. I took a sip of my sparkling water. The liquid was ice cold, but the chill in my veins was colder. Restructuring some family assets. My father was a commercial real estate broker whose commissions had plummeted during the recent market downturn. He drove a leased vehicle. He carried a heavy mortgage on his home. There were no hidden family assets waiting to be liquidated. There was no secret venture capital fund. There was only the Callaway Supplemental Needs Trust. The mathematics of his betrayal clicked into place with flawless precision. $320,000 sat in a protected account, meant to keep me alive. He had forged the amendment naming himself as the sole beneficiary upon my death. He had attempted to gaslight my rheumatologist into documenting a steep, irreversible decline in my health to justify his permanent control over my care. And now the golden child needed an immediate bailout to maintain her social standing. He could not simply withdraw $80,000 from my trust and hand it to Harper. The fiduciary laws in Minnesota are stringent, requiring annual accounting to prove the funds are spent on the disabled beneficiary. But if he held a medical and financial power of attorney, if he could somehow launder the money through exorbitant management fees, or if he could establish a precedent of withdrawing large sums for my supposed home care modifications, he could siphon the cash to save her boutique. I was looking at two predators. One was orchestrating the theft, and the other felt entirely entitled to the spoils. Harper wiped her eyes with a cloth napkin, her posture relaxing instantly. The crisis had been outsourced. She looked at me, offering a weak, patronizing smile, and told me she hoped my joints were not acting up with the incoming snowstorm. She spoke to me with the gentle, condescending tone one might use for a fragile pet. She viewed my life as a tragic limitation, unaware that I possessed the cognitive blueprints to dismantle her entire future. I smiled back. I told her I was managing perfectly well. I complimented her cashmere sweater. I played the role of the quiet, unassuming sister to perfection. You do not interrupt the enemy when they are finalizing their own trap. The dinner concluded with forced cheer. Harper departed, wrapping herself in a designer wool coat, secure in the knowledge that her father would once again shield her from the consequences of her own incompetence. I helped clear the table, stacking the china plates and carrying them to the sink. My father stood beside me, rinsing the silverware. The kitchen was warm, smelling of lemon soap and roasted fish. He handed me a dried plate. He kept his voice casual, adopting the tone of a man mentioning a trivial errand. He noted that the end of the year was approaching and mentioned the trust required its usual administrative maintenance. He asked if I could stop by his office on Thursday evening after work. He said there were some routine annual trust acknowledgments that required my signature for the bank. I placed the dry plate into the cupboard. Routine annual trust acknowledgments. There was no such requirement in the Callaway Trust Charter. My grandmother had specifically designed the fund to require zero administrative burden on my end. The document he wanted me to sign on Thursday would not be routine. It would be the mechanism he needed to access the $80,000. It would be the proxy, the waiver, or the financial release required to crack open my safety net and drain it for Harper. I turned to him, my expression blank and agreeable. I told him Thursday evening worked perfectly for my schedule. He patted my shoulder, praising my flexibility, oblivious to the fact that I had just accepted his invitation to war. I walked out to my car, the frozen Minnesota night biting at my face. I had 3 days to prepare the countermeasure. Thursday was going to be an education in consequence. Monday morning arrived with a biting wind chill that turned the sky the color of a bruised iron skillet. I requested a half-day of personal leave from my logistics firm. My manager approved it without a second thought, likely assuming my autoimmune condition required another sudden medical intervention. I let him believe the fiction. The reality was much sharper. I drove away from my corporate campus and headed straight into the historic district of St. Paul. The architecture here shifts from modern glass facades to heavy limestone and deep brick, reflecting a city that values permanence and consequence. My destination was a building overlooking the frozen expanse of the Mississippi River, housing a firm that dealt exclusively in generational wealth and estate preservation. I walked into a quiet mahogany-paneled office that smelled of lemon polish and aged paper. Evelyn Croft sat behind a desk that looked more like a defensive fortification than a piece of furniture. Evelyn was the estate solicitor who had drafted the original Callaway Trust for my grandmother a decade ago. She was a woman carved from pure pragmatism, possessing silver hair cut into a sharp bob and a stare that could freeze boiling water. She had guided my grandmother through the intricate labyrinth of asset protection. Evelyn respected capital, but she revered intent. She did not tolerate fools, and she despised thieves. I took a seat in the high-backed leather guest chair. I did not offer pleasantries or weather complaints. I pulled my secure tablet from my tote bag, unlocked the screen, and slid the device across the emerald green desk blotter. I told her I needed her to authenticate a modification to my medical safety net. Evelyn adjusted her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose. She tapped the screen, scrolling through the high-resolution photographs I had taken in my father's home office. The silence in the room deepened, punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I watched Evelyn read the forged beneficiary clause. The professional detachment she wore like armor fractured right in front of me. Her jaw set into a rigid, unforgiving line. She zoomed in on the notary seal, her eyes narrowing at the inked signature beside it. When she looked up at me, the polite warmth of a former family ally was gone. In its place was the calculating, predatory chill of a litigator going to war. She set the tablet down with deliberate care. She explained that under Minnesota statute, a trustee holds a sacred duty of loyalty. The state legislature views the management of a disabled beneficiary fund not as a financial privilege, but as a sworn oath. Our local culture protects the vulnerable with an iron fist, and the courts pursue self-dealing with swift severity. Evelyn pointed at the digital image detailing the precise mechanism of the theft. My father had exploited a standard administrative power originally intended for updating tax addresses and minor clerical errors. He weaponized this obscure loophole to bypass the judicial oversight typically required for a beneficiary swap. He had effectively written himself a post-mortem check, ensuring that my passing would trigger a financial windfall directly into his personal accounts. The gravity of the betrayal hung in the air. Evelyn folded her hands over the desk. She cautioned me about the speed of the justice system. The penalty for this level of fiduciary fraud is severe, but the courts are deeply methodical. If we simply presented the altered document to a judge today, my father would immediately claim it was a misunderstanding, a rough draft intended for legal review, or a clerical error by a subordinate. He would stall. He would hire defense attorneys who specialize in muddying the waters and delaying hearings. In the meantime, the Thursday dinner meeting was looming like a ticking explosive. My father was preparing to compel my signature on a proxy that would unlock the $80,000 Harper needed to save her failing lifestyle brand. A prolonged legal battle over a drafted amendment would give him the necessary window to drain the account, liquidate the assets, and hide the capital behind shell companies before a judge could intervene. I asked her what the legal counterstrike required. How could we bypass the bureaucratic delays and secure an immediate injunction to stop him before Thursday evening? Evelyn leaned forward, steepling her fingers. She outlined a surgical strategy. We needed a smoking gun that proved active ongoing financial harm. A forged document indicated a future intent to steal, but documented embezzlement proved execution. If we could show the fiduciary board that David was already skimming funds from the trust, we could secure an emergency ex parte order. This specific legal maneuver would freeze his access, instantly strip him of his trustee status without requiring his presence in a courtroom, and appoint a neutral corporate fiduciary to protect the remainder of the fund. To execute this strike, we needed the raw transaction logs. My father was required by state law to maintain detailed ledgers of the trust activity. For years, he had waved off my requests for these documents with vague, high-level summary sheets. He always claimed he wanted to spare me the administrative fatigue, insisting I focus solely on my health. I realize now he was deliberately blinding me to the ledger. Evelyn told me that if a man is preparing to steal $80,000 in one sweep, he has likely been testing the fences for years. He would be siphoning smaller, less noticeable amounts to fund his lifestyle and measure his own security. I needed to find those smaller thefts. I needed the bank routing numbers, the unauthorized withdrawals, the phantom invoices. Evelyn warned me that obtaining this proof required operating in the absolute shadows. If David suspected for a single second that I was auditing the fund, he could destroy the digital trail transfer the remaining balance offshore and leave me with nothing but legal fees and a terminal diagnosis. I had 72 hours until the trap closed on Thursday. I looked at the uncompromising solicitor across the desk. I felt a fundamental shift in my own internal architecture. The shock of the betrayal evaporated, replaced by the cool, logical processing of a database query. I was no longer a fragile daughter managing an autoimmune disease. I was a data scientist hunting a compromised variable. My father believed my illness made me weak. He failed to understand that living with a chronic condition requires ruthless daily management, hypervigilance, and the ability to track shifting metrics in real time. He had picked a fight with a woman who built predictive models for a living. I stood up, retrieving my tablet from the desk. I promised Evelyn I would return with the forensic proof she needed to secure the injunction. She nodded once, a gesture of profound professional respect, and told me to watch my back. I left the mahogany-paneled office and stepped back out into the freezing Minnesota afternoon. The wind whipped my coat around my knees. My mind was already parsing the algorithms required to bypass my father's rudimentary security protocols. But before I could run the numbers and follow the money, I needed a deeper understanding of the enemy's motivation. I needed to see exactly how entitled the golden child felt to my survival fund. If Harper was the catalyst for this upcoming $80,000 theft, I wanted to observe her behavior in her natural habitat. I pulled out my phone standing on the icy sidewalk and drafted a casual text message to my sister. I offered to swing by her failing boutique that afternoon to help her organize inventory, framing it as an act of supportive sibling solidarity. She replied instantly with a string of grateful emojis. It was time to look the primary beneficiary of this theft directly in the eye and listen to how she justified the cost of her own ambition. I parked my car on a gentrified avenue in Minneapolis, stepping out into a fierce headwind that threatened to cut through my wool coat. The neighborhood was a highly curated collection of artisanal bakeries, cold-pressed juice bars, and high-end fitness studios. Harper operated her boutique Lumina and Loam nestled between a custom stationery shop and a dog bakery. The storefront featured a minimalist window display. A single twisted birch branch draped with raw silk hung suspended above a hand-poured concrete bowl. It looked like a museum exhibit for objects nobody actually needed. I pushed the heavy glass door open. A brass bell chimed overhead. The air inside smelled of crushed fig and imported sage. It was the scent of manufactured serenity masking a business model built on quicksand. Harper stood behind a reclaimed wood counter, frantically tapping the screen of a rose gold tablet. She looked up, her expression shifting instantly from panic to a brilliant, practiced welcome. She wore a tailored linen jumpsuit that defied the freezing Minnesota temperature outside, looking perfectly staged for a lifestyle magazine cover. I offered a warm greeting, playing the role of the supportive younger sister to perfection. I told her I had wrapped up my work projects early and wanted to help sort the holiday shipment she had been crying over at Sunday dinner. She let out a dramatic sigh of relief, rounding the counter to embrace me. We moved to the back stockroom, a stark contrast to the polished retail floor. Cardboard boxes were piled haphazardly against the exposed brick walls. Past due invoices spilled out of an overflowing wire basket on a folding table. Harper handed me a clipboard and asked me to count a new shipment of hand-dipped taper candles that retailed for $40 a pair. I began opening the cardboard flaps, methodically checking the wax stems against the packing slip. My hands moved with steady precision, sorting the inventory while my mind cataloged her behavior. Harper unpacked a crate of woven seagrass baskets, her earlier desperation replaced by a breezy, almost manic optimism. She chatted brightly about upcoming marketing campaigns and local influencer partnerships, projecting an illusion of a limitless financial runway. I kept my tone light and conversational, asking her how she managed to secure the bridge loan she needed so quickly. I watched her reflection in a tilted floor mirror, leaning against the brick wall. Harper let out a soft, conspiratorial laugh. She tossed a crumpled piece of bubble wrap into a recycling bin and leaned against a stack of boxes. She said Dad was working his magic, She lowered her voice, adopting a tone of sisterly confidentiality, admitting she had been terrified on Sunday night. She confessed she thought the storefront was doomed, but Dad had assured her the cash infusion was practically guaranteed by Thursday. Then she said the words that severed the final thread of my familial loyalty. She smiled, a gesture devoid of any actual warmth, and said she was just so grateful Dad was willing to secure her inheritance early. She waved a hand in the air, a dismissive flick of her manicured fingers. She added that the arrangement made perfect sense considering the unfortunate circumstances. She looked me directly in the eye, her expression composed of toxic pity and staggering entitlement. She told me that I did not really need all that money anyway, given how restricted my lifestyle was. She noted that I rarely traveled due to my flare-ups, that I could not enjoy extreme sports, and that my world was just inherently smaller now. She framed the theft of my medical safety net as a practical reallocation of surplus funds. I held a pair of charcoal-colored taper candles. The wax was smooth and cold against my skin. I did not drop them. My heart rate did not spike. The training of a data scientist teaches you to process shocking inputs without corrupting the core operating system. I analyzed her statement in real time. Harper did not just view the trust as a convenient bank account waiting to be tapped. She viewed my life as a lesser existence. To my older sister, my chronic illness was not a tragedy to be mitigated or a burden to be eased. It was a financial efficiency. My perceived physical limitations justified her extraction of my capital. In her mind, I was a depreciating asset, and she was the healthy, able-bodied investment deserving of the funds. She was building an empire of linen and sage on the assumption that my body would fail, and she was annoyed that I was taking too long to expire. I placed the candles carefully back into their designated cardboard slot. I checked a box on the clipboard with a black pen. I felt the last lingering ghost of guilt evaporate from my chest, rising up and disappearing into the cold air. Until this exact moment, a small, fragile part of me had wondered if destroying my father's reputation and shattering our family dynamic was an overreaction. Perhaps Harper was just a naive bystander, unaware of the criminal mechanics funding her vanity project. Perhaps she was just desperate and foolish. That illusion was now dead. She knew exactly what she was taking, and she believed she fundamentally deserved it. The betrayal was total. I finished the inventory sheet, handed the clipboard back to her, and dusted my hands. I told her the count was accurate, and that the taper candles were fully stocked. Harper thanked me, offering a quick, hollow hug that smelled of expensive dry shampoo and synthetic fig. We walked back out to the retail floor, our footsteps muffled by the thick woven rugs. I stopped at a display table near the cash register. I picked up a single heavy glass jar containing a soy candle scented with cedar and clove. The price tag read $40. I placed it on the counter and pulled out my credit card. Harper blinked, looking surprised, and offered to give the item to me at wholesale cost. I declined, smiling a genuine, relaxed smile. I told her I wanted to support the business at full retail price. I watched her ring up the transaction. She handed me the stylized paper bag and thanked me for being such a supportive sister. I told her I would see her at Dad's house on Thursday for the paperwork signing. I turned and walked out the door, the brass bell chiming my departure. I stepped back onto the frozen pavement, the icy wind rushing through my coat. The candle weighed heavy in the paper bag. It was a $40 receipt for the death of my familial obligation. I climbed into my car, the interior still holding the bitter cold of the Minnesota afternoon. I placed the shopping bag on the passenger seat. I no longer needed to tiptoe around the edges of their deception. I had looked the primary beneficiary of the theft in the eye and found zero remorse. The emotional audit was finished. It was time to execute the technical extraction. I started the engine, shifted the vehicle into drive, and merged onto the snow-dusted avenue. My townhouse was waiting for me. I needed to access the secure portal of the regional bank that held the trust. I needed to bypass the superficial summary sheets my father provided and dig into the raw transactional metadata. He thought he was dealing with a sick, compliant daughter who trusted his paternal oversight. He was about to find out what happens when you hand a complex financial puzzle to a woman who spends 40 hours a week hunting anomalies in global logistics networks. The shadows were waiting, and I had a ledger to dissect. I placed the paper bag containing the cedar candle on my kitchen counter. The sun had already dipped below the St. Paul skyline, plunging my townhouse into early winter shadows. I bypassed the light switches and walked straight into my home office. My workspace is an extension of my central nervous system. 2 curved monitors flank a primary screen, all mounted above a heavy oak desk. I tapped the spacebar on my keyboard. The screens flared to life, bathing the room in a sharp, clinical blue light. In my professional life, I trace missing freight across global supply chains. I isolate routing errors and logistical bottlenecks within enormous datasets containing millions of interacting variables. My father's financial subterfuge was a comparatively simple algorithm. I just needed to access the raw inputs. For years, David had satisfied his fiduciary reporting duties by emailing me a flattened document in late January. It was always a high-level summary sheet showing the starting balance, the approved medical payouts, and the closing balance. It was a curated narrative stripped of all identifying metadata. He relied on my fatigue to keep me from asking questions. But under Minnesota trust law, a beneficiary of age holds the statutory right to request full, unredacted transactional records directly from the holding institution. I did not ask my father for permission. I logged into the regional bank's secure portal using my beneficiary credentials. The bank interface was an outdated relic of legacy financial software. I bypassed the consumer dashboard and requested a direct data export covering the last 48 months of account activity. A progress bar loaded across my screen. 5 seconds later, a raw comma-separated values file landed in my downloads folder. The rhythmic clicking of my mechanical keyboard filled the silent room. Click, clack, click. The sound is a metronome for my focus. I opened my terminal window and began writing a script to clean the incoming data. I stripped away the useless formatting headers, normalized the date strings, and categorized the outbound cash flows. I instructed the program to isolate the legitimate medical expenses first. The copays for my rheumatologist, the pharmacy deductibles, the invoices from the specialized infusion clinic. I assigned those data points a cool green color. They matched my own personal health records perfectly. David was careful enough to pay the real bills on time. He needed to maintain his facade as the diligent self-sacrificing caretaker in the eyes of the clinical staff. But once the legitimate medical transactions were filtered out and pushed to the side, the residual code remained on my screen. My eyes scanned the lines of text. There it was. The anomaly I had been hunting. Hidden beneath the sporadic high-cost medical disbursements was a steady, rhythmic leak. I highlighted a recurring automated clearinghouse withdrawal of $2,500. It executed on the 15th of every single month like clockwork. The rhythmic clicking of my keys accelerated as I isolated the withdrawal code and expanded the transaction details. The bank descriptor was vague. It simply read, "Administrative management fee." For a trust of this size, a professional corporate fiduciary might charge 1% annually to manage the portfolio. My father, acting as a supposedly loving family trustee, was charging roughly 10% a year just to write 3 checks a month. But the exorbitant rate was only the first layer of the crime. A fee is a justification. I needed to know the destination of the routing number. I ran the destination account through an open-source financial routing database. The receiving institution was a commercial credit union based in a wealthy Minneapolis suburb. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the Minnesota Secretary of State Business Registry. I queried the exact legal entity name attached to the routing profile. The state search engine spun for 2 seconds before rendering a public filing document. The entity receiving my money was a limited liability company called Apex Consulting Holdings. It had been incorporated exactly 3 years ago, right around the time my father's commercial real estate commissions began to dry up during the market downturn. I scrolled down the digital page to view the registered agent details. The name printed on the state registry was David Harrison. The business address listed was his home office in the suburbs. It was the exact room where I had fixed his router and photographed his forged amendment just days prior. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The blue light from the monitors reflected in my eyes. The mathematics of his betrayal were elementary. $2,500 a month multiplied by 36 months. $90,000. He had not just rewritten a document to steal my safety net after my death. He was actively draining it in the present. He was skimming $90,000 to fund his leased luxury vehicle and his country club dues, all while accepting casseroles and pity from the neighborhood for his tragic burden. The narrative he sold to the world was that my illness was draining his soul. The truth was that my illness was funding his lifestyle. Evelyn Croft had told me that morning that we needed proof of active financial harm to secure an emergency injunction from the fiduciary board. I had just found the murder weapon complete with his fingerprints stamped on the handle. I opened a data visualization software suite. I fed my sorted script into the program to build an irrefutable color-coded forensic timeline. The legitimate medical expenses formed a flat, predictable baseline in calm green. The stolen management fees spiked in jagged, predatory crimson, a steady heartbeat of theft marching across the axis of the chart. The contrast was devastating. I exported the visualized timeline into a secure file and appended the state registry documents linking his name to the shell company. I had forged the bullet. It was sleek, documented, and undeniable. I closed the terminal window and shut down the monitors. The room plunged back into darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside my window. Thursday evening was approaching fast. My father expected me to walk into his house, drink his sparkling water, and blindly sign a proxy document that would allow him to siphon the remaining $80,000 for Harper's failing boutique. He thought he was luring a docile, chronically ill daughter into a bureaucratic snare. He believed my fatigue made me an easy mark. He did not realize I was walking into his ambush with a loaded forensic arsenal. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of ice water. I drank it in the dark, feeling the cold liquid slide down my throat, calculating the exact trajectory required to ensure that when I fired the shot, the impact would leave no survivors. The phone vibrated against the kitchen counter on Thursday afternoon. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing before answering with a bright, untroubled greeting. He sounded jovial, projecting the forced, easy charm of a salesman finalizing a lucrative deal. He reminded me about our evening meeting, suggesting I drop by around 7 to review the trust maintenance files. He framed it as a minor errand, a brief hurdle before we could enjoy the upcoming weekend. I agreed, maintaining a cheerful facade while my mind categorized his tone as a primary threat indicator. I arrived at his suburban home just as the streetlights flickered on, casting long, frozen shadows across the manicured lawns. The temperature had plummeted, turning the remaining snow into jagged sheets of ice. I walked through the front door, slipping my coat onto the mahogany rack. My father greeted me in the hallway. He wore a plush cashmere sweater and held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. The house smelled of roasted garlic and expensive pine candles. He offered me a glass of sparkling water, guiding me straight toward his home office. The room looked exactly as it had on my previous visit. The leather-bound biographies aligned on the shelves. The brass cup holding his fountain pens. But the ivory envelope containing his forged beneficiary amendment was conspicuously absent. In its place on the polished desk blotter rested a stark white packet of legal documents neatly stapled, accompanied by a silver pen. He directed me to sit in one of the leather guest chairs. He took his place behind the desk, steepled his fingers, and exhaled a long, heavy sigh. It was a theatrical release of breath designed to convey immense paternal exhaustion. He began a carefully rehearsed monologue about the escalating complexities of healthcare administration. He lamented the hours he supposedly spent navigating insurance bureaucracies on my behalf. He lowered his voice to a gentle, sorrowful pitch, telling me how much it terrified him to see me struggle during my autoimmune flare-ups. He claimed he wanted nothing more than to absorb all that stressful administrative weight, so I could focus entirely on healing. He slid the packet across the desk. He described it as a standard consolidation form, a routine update to streamline our financial communications with the bank. He uncapped the silver pen and placed it next to the pages. I picked up the document. The header did not mention an annual trust acknowledgement. The bold text at the top of the first page read, "Durable medical and financial power of attorney." I kept my facial muscles entirely relaxed, forcing my eyes to scan the paragraphs at a casual, unhurried pace. The legal clauses were comprehensive and predatory. If I applied my signature to the bottom of the final page, I would be granting him unfettered unilateral control over my entire existence. The financial section authorized him to access my personal checking accounts, liquidate my assets, and make sweeping wealth transfers without my consent. This was the key he needed to bypass the strict fiduciary safeguards and siphon the $80,000 to Harper. But the medical section was even colder. It granted him the ultimate authority to dictate my clinical care. He could overrule my rheumatologist. He could alter my treatment plans. He could legally lock me into a narrative of irreversible decline, effectively turning me into a ward of his financial ambitions. The trap was meticulously constructed, designed to strip away my autonomy and reduce my life to a line item on his balance sheet. He leaned forward, watching my eyes track across the paper. He urged me to just sign at the bottom flags, assuring me it was all standard boilerplate terminology. He patted his chest, claiming it would bring him such profound peace of mind to know I was fully protected under his umbrella. The claustrophobia of the moment pressed against my ribs. In a confined space with a predator, the instinct to fight or flee is overwhelming. A refusal would ignite an immediate confrontation. If I threw the pen down and accused him of extortion, he would realize I understood his endgame. He would panic, lock down the trust accounts, and deploy an army of defense lawyers to bleed my resources dry before Evelyn Croft could file the injunction. I needed to escape this room with the unsigned documents, but I had to do it without triggering his alarm systems. I did not retreat, and I did not attack. I deployed a tactic I used during contentious data audits with hostile corporate clients. I feigned meticulous bureaucratic confusion. I squinted at page 3, tracing a line of text with my index finger. I furrowed my brow, projecting the image of an overly cautious professional bogged down in trivial details. I tapped the financial transfer clause and asked him if this specific wording would trigger a taxable event under the newly revised state tax codes. I noted that the recent legislative changes regarding intermingled family assets were incredibly dense, and I expressed a deep neurotic concern about accidental tax liabilities. I watched his benevolent mask fracture. A micro-expression of sheer irritation flashed across his eyes. He waved his hand dismissively, stating that the bank had already vetted the language, and there were no tax implications. He pushed the silver pen an inch closer to my hand. I shook my head, adopting a tone of apologetic stubbornness. I explained that my personal certified public accountant was notoriously strict about these exact clauses. I manufactured a fictional scenario involving a coworker who had faced a severe audit due to a similar financial proxy. I insisted that I simply could not sign anything granting external financial access until my accountant verified the tax compliance. I promised him it was just a formality, a quick digital review to satisfy my own rigid financial habits. He sat back in his chair. The amber liquid in his tumbler sloshed against the crystal rim. He could not reasonably deny my request without exposing his desperate need for immediate control. To forbid a successful data scientist from consulting her own accountant would shatter his performance as the protective, caring father. It would reveal the urgency of Harper's impending bankruptcy. He forced a tight, rigid smile. The muscles in his neck strained against the collar of his cashmere sweater. He told me he admired my diligence, but emphasized that the bank required the updated files by the end of the week to ensure there were no disruptions in my medical coverage. It was a subtle threat, a reminder that he currently held the keys to my healthcare safety net. I smiled back, radiating eager compliance. I promised him I would email a scanned copy to my accountant first thing in the morning and secure the approval by the weekend. Before he could formulate another counter-argument, I folded the thick legal packet, slid it smoothly into my leather tote bag, and stood up from the guest chair. I thanked him for looking out for me. I thanked him for going through the trouble of drafting the protective measures. I delivered the gratitude with flawless, chilling sincerity. I walked out of the home office, retrieved my coat from the hallway rack, and stepped back out into the freezing night. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. I walked down the driveway, the frozen pavement crunching under my boots. I had successfully extracted the physical evidence of his extortion. The unsigned power of attorney in my bag was the final nail required for Evelyn Croft's legal petition. But as I started my car and watched the exhaust curl into the frigid air, I knew my father would not simply accept a bureaucratic delay. His timeline was shrinking. Harper was panicking. He needed that signature to save his golden child, and polite persistence was about to escalate into forced isolation. The subtle maneuvers were ending. As I drove away from the suburbs, my phone illuminated with an incoming calendar invite. It was a notification for a mandatory weekend trip to the family lake cabin. The trap had failed in his office, so he was moving the venue. He intended to corner me in the deep woods far away from my townhouse, my accountant, and my escape routes. The real confrontation was just beginning. The drive north from the Twin Cities took 2.5 hours, guiding my sedan through a frozen corridor of towering pine trees. The calendar invitation my father had sent was framed as a spontaneous weekend retreat, but the timing was a transparent tactical maneuver. The family lake cabin represented the pristine core of the Harrison mythology. It was a sprawling structure of varnished cedar and river stone, sitting on the edge of an unnamed frozen lake. For decades, it had served as the backdrop for our curated holiday cards, projecting an image of unshakable unity. In reality, it was a geographic isolation chamber. The cellular signal dropped to a single fluctuating bar the moment you turned off the county highway. David chose this location because it severed my access to external resources. He intended to corner me in the deep woods far away from my townhouse and my phantom accountant. I arrived late on Friday evening. My sister's pristine white SUV was already parked in the driveway, covered in a fresh dusting of snow. I carried my duffel bag up the wooden steps, feeling the bitter wind bite at my exposed neck. When I stepped inside, the cabin smelled of burning birchwood and simmering chili. David and Harper greeted me with exaggerated warmth, playing their roles with desperate enthusiasm. The evening passed in a haze of forced smiles and hollow conversation. I played along, offering benign comments about the weather and the difficult driving conditions. Saturday dragged on under a suffocating layer of tension. Harper paced the hardwood floors of the great room, her eyes darting constantly to her phone screen. Her lifestyle brand was hemorrhaging capital. Her suppliers were demanding payment, and the lack of reliable internet service in the cabin was pushing her into a state of visible panic. She chewed her thumbnail, a nervous habit she had harbored since high school whenever her credit cards were declined. David spent the afternoon forcefully splitting firewood behind the shed, working off a restless, predatory energy. I sat near the soaring stone fireplace with a novel resting on my lap, quietly observing their psychological deterioration. They were waiting for the sun to go down. They needed the cover of night to spring the trap. The confrontation began shortly after 8 o'clock. The wind had picked up, howling across the frozen lake and rattling the heavy window panes. The temperature outside had dropped well below zero. David poured himself a generous measure of bourbon and took a seat in the leather armchair directly across from me. Harper abandoned her pacing and sat on the sofa to my left, effectively boxing me into the corner of the room. The fire cracked in the hearth, casting long, erratic shadows against the cedar walls. My father leaned forward, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He skipped the gentle preamble he had used in his home office. He asked if I had managed to email the documents to my accountant. I met his gaze with steady, placid eyes. I told him my accountant had taken a long weekend to go skiing in Colorado and was unreachable until Monday morning. The veneer of the benevolent patriarch fractured. David set his glass down on the coffee table with a sharp, echoing thud. The sound hung in the silent room. He told me that waiting until Monday was unacceptable. He reached into the side pocket of his canvas duffel bag and produced a fresh, pristine copy of The Power of Attorney, along with a black ink pen. He placed them on the table between us. He stated that the bank deadline was inflexible and that I needed to sign the proxy immediately so he could scan and fax it from the local general store first thing in the morning. I looked at the paperwork, then back to his face. I kept my voice perfectly level. I reiterated that I do not sign financial proxies without a professional tax review. Harper shattered the quiet. She uncrossed her legs, leaning toward me with her face flushed and her voice trembling with indignation. She abandoned the supportive sister routine, unleashing a torrent of weaponized guilt. She accused me of being impossibly selfish. She recounted a curated history of my illness, listing the late-night hospital visits, the specialist appointments, and the supposed toll it had taken on our father. She painted David as a tireless saint and framed my cautious financial boundaries as a cruel betrayal of his devotion. She demanded to know if I had any idea what he sacrificed to keep me comfortable. She insisted that signing a simple piece of paper was the bare minimum I could do to repay him for years of carrying my burden. Her voice grew shrill, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. She was projecting her own terror of bankruptcy onto my medical history, using my autoimmune disease as a blunt instrument to bash me into compliance. She needed that $80,000 to maintain her illusion of success, and she viewed my refusal as sheer, ungrateful spite. I sat perfectly still, letting her words crash over me like water hitting a stone breakwater. I did not defend myself. I did not point out that I scheduled my own appointments and paid my own premiums. Emotional arguments are designed to pull you into the mud. When you argue with a desperate person, you legitimize their premise. I simply watched her hyperventilate, processing her outburst as a predictable data output from a failing system. Seeing that Harper's guilt trip had failed to elicit a tearful surrender, David deployed his ultimate weapon. He stood up, towering over the coffee table. The firelight illuminated the harsh, unforgiving lines of his face. He spoke in a low, resonant tone, stripped of all warmth. He delivered the ultimatum. He told me that managing the complex web of my healthcare was breaking his spirit. He declared that if I refused to sign the document and grant him the necessary control to streamline the administration, he would wash his hands of the entire ordeal. He threatened to step back entirely. He promised to call my rheumatologist, the clinic nurses, and our neighbors in St. Paul to inform them that he could no longer bear the physical and emotional weight of my care. He was threatening me with profound social exile. In a community that prizes familial support, he was promising to broadcast a narrative where I was the difficult, unmanageable daughter who pushed away her loving father. He intended to sever my ties to the community sympathy network, leaving me isolated to navigate a hostile medical system alone. He believed that the prospect of losing his protective shadow would terrify me into submission because he fundamentally misunderstood the source of my strength. The silence that followed his threat was heavy and expectant. The wind battered the side of the cabin. David and Harper stared at me, waiting for the capitulation, waiting for me to reach for the black pen and sign my autonomy away in exchange for their conditional love. I looked down at the fire, watching a charred log break apart and send a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. My heart rate remained steady. My breathing was even. I felt a chilling, resolute clarity. They had shown me the full extent of their cruelty, laying all their cards on the table. There were no more mysteries to uncover. I stood up, smoothing the front of my wool sweater. I did not look at the pen. I did not look at the fraudulent documents. I looked directly into my father's cold eyes and then shifted my gaze to my sister's panicked face. I will handle the paperwork on Monday. I turned my back on them and walked toward the wooden staircase. I did not rush. I climbed the steps with measured, deliberate pacing. I walked down the short hallway, entered my guest bedroom, and closed the solid pine door behind me, turning the brass lock with a definitive click. I left them standing in the great room, stewing in the suffocating reality of their own desperation. The trap they had built in the deep woods had failed to spring. They had tried to break me with isolation and threats, but they had only succeeded in proving their own guilt. The tension vibrating through the floorboards was unbearable, but it did not belong to me. It belonged to the two predators who realized their prey had just casually walked out of the cage. Monday was coming, and I was bringing a very different kind of paperwork to the table. I left the cabin before dawn on Sunday morning. The sky over the frozen lake was a bruised purple, and the silence of the deep woods felt brittle enough to snap. I did not leave a note. I packed my duffel bag in the dark, stepped carefully over the creaking floorboards, and slipped out the back door. By the time my father and sister woke to find my guest room empty, I was already 60 miles south on the interstate, driving back toward the steel and glass reality of the Twin Cities. I spent the remainder of Sunday in my home office, verifying every line of code in my forensic timeline. I double-checked the bank routing numbers, cross-referenced the state registry filings for Apex Consulting Holdings, and printed hard copies of the illicit management fee withdrawals. Data is only as powerful as its presentation. I compiled the evidence into a sleek, undeniable portfolio. Monday morning broke with a pale, indifferent sun. I walked into Evelyn Croft's mahogany-paneled office at exactly 9 o'clock. The receptionist had poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and the scent of the beans mingled with the familiar smell of aged paper and lemon polish. Evelyn was seated behind her defensive fortification of a desk wearing a tailored charcoal suit. She did not waste breath on trivial morning greetings. She looked at the heavy leather portfolio I carried and asked simply what I had found. I unclasped the portfolio and slid 3 distinct items across the polished green desk blotter. First, the color-coded timeline isolating the $90,000 in skimmed administrative fees. Second, the public state registry document linking the receiving shell company directly to my father. Third, the uncreased, unsigned medical and financial power of attorney he had tried to force upon me. Evelyn picked up the timeline. Her eyes tracked the jagged crimson spikes representing the stolen monthly disbursements. She cross-referenced the dates with the shell company incorporation filing. Then she picked up the power of attorney packet. She read the sweeping medical control clauses and the broad financial authorizations. The professional detachment that usually characterized her demeanor vanished. Her posture stiffened. She placed the documents down with precise, deliberate care. The silence in the room was dense, charged with a specific kind of legal fury that does not shout but rather calculates the exact trajectory of a lethal strike. She looked at me, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register. She stated that what we were looking at was not merely a breach of duty. It was a masterclass in predatory self-dealing. She explained that under the rigorous protective statutes of Minnesota, a trustee skimming capital to fund a shell corporation is grounds for immediate judicial intervention. But coupling that theft with a fraudulent power of attorney designed to strip a vulnerable beneficiary of her clinical autonomy elevated the situation from civil malpractice to the precipice of criminal embezzlement. My father had grown arrogant. He had operated for years under the assumption that his status as a beloved community figure would insulate him from scrutiny. He believed that holding the title of a sacrificing parent granted him immunity from the ledger. Evelyn informed me that the probate courts in our jurisdiction do not care about neighborhood block parties or church fundraisers. They care about the math, and the math on the desk was damning. I asked her what our next move was. I told her I did not want a protracted multi-year litigation battle that would drag my medical history through public records. I wanted a swift, decapitating strike that severed his access permanently. I wanted the trust secured, the stolen funds repaid, and the golden child left to face her own bankruptcy without my safety net. Evelyn pulled a legal pad from her drawer and uncapped a gold fountain pen. She outlined the anatomy of our counteroffensive. We would not wait for a court date. We would file an ex parte emergency petition for his immediate suspension. This specialized legal maneuver bypasses the standard notification period, preventing the offending trustee from liquidating assets or destroying records before the hearing. The petition would contain 3 non-negotiable demands. First, the immediate involuntary removal of David Harrison as trustee, citing egregious fiduciary breach and documented self-dealing. Second, a binding court order transferring the balance of the Callaway Supplemental Needs Trust to a neutral corporate fiduciary management firm based in Minneapolis. This firm would be devoid of emotion, operating solely on algorithms and statutory compliance, ensuring my father could never touch another dime. Third, a formal demand for the full restitution of the $90,000 stolen through his phantom management fees, requiring him to liquidate his own personal retirement accounts or sell his assets to make the trust whole. Evelyn paused, the tip of her pen hovering over the legal pad. She looked at me with a sharp, assessing gaze. She warned me that serving this petition would trigger a catastrophic family implosion. It would strip away the facade he had built for decades. He would lose his social currency, his financial leverage, and his control over my narrative. She needed to know if I was prepared for the fallout, because once she filed the injunction, the machinery of the justice system could not easily be halted. I thought about the Sunday dinner. I thought about Harper crying into her wine glass, demanding $80,000 to save her lifestyle brand. I thought about the cold, calculated look in my father's eyes at the lake cabin when he threatened to abandon my medical care and isolate me from our community. They had shown no hesitation when they planned to dismantle my life. I felt zero hesitation returning the favor. I told Evelyn to draft the petition. She nodded, turning her attention to her computer terminal. For the next 2 hours, the room was filled with the rapid staccato rhythm of her typing. She translated my raw data into a devastating legal narrative. She attached the forensic timeline as Exhibit A. She attached the shell company registry as Exhibit B. She attached the unexecuted power of attorney as Exhibit C, establishing a clear pattern of escalating financial predation. To seal the trap, Evelyn drafted a separate formal notice of intent. This document would serve as the ultimate leverage. It outlined that if David attempted to fight the transition, contested the repayment of the stolen funds, or tried to delay the handover to the corporate fiduciary, we would take the forensic evidence directly to the county prosecutor and pursue felony embezzlement charges. We were offering him a choice between a quiet, devastating financial surrender or a highly publicized criminal trial that would end with him in a state penitentiary. When the documents were finished, Evelyn printed them on heavy, watermarked paper. She arranged the pages on the desk in front of me. She handed me the gold fountain pen. I looked at the signature line on the final page of the petition. Signing this paper meant erasing the version of myself that had stayed quiet in exam rooms while my father spoke over me. It meant permanently retiring the identity of the fragile, compliant daughter. It meant stepping into the cold, unyielding reality of consequence. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. I signed my name with smooth, unbroken strokes. The ink dried instantly in the dry, winter air. Evelyn gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the desk to align the pages. She slipped them into a thick legal folder. The trap was fully set. The bureaucratic mechanisms were armed and ready to execute. There was no going back, and for the first time since I discovered the forged amendment on his desk, my left shoulder did not ache. I stood up and buttoned my wool coat. I needed to schedule a meeting. I pulled my phone from my pocket and navigated to my messaging application. I drafted a brief, accommodating text to my father, telling him I had returned from the cabin and was ready to finalize the paperwork he needed. I suggested a neutral location for the exchange, far away from the isolation of his suburban home and the deep woods of the lake. The checkmate required the proper stage. I hit send, knowing he would interpret the message as a total surrender. He was expecting a victory lap. He was about to walk into an ambush of his own making. I waited until Tuesday morning to make the call. Letting Monday pass in total silence was a calculated variable in the equation. It allowed the anxiety to marinate in my father's mind, convincing him that my abrupt departure from the lake cabin was a frantic emotional retreat. When I finally dialed his number, the line barely rang twice before he picked up. I kept my voice light, infusing it with the weary resignation of a daughter who had finally decided to stop fighting the current. I told him I had reviewed the documents and was ready to finalize the administrative updates. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by the smooth, manufactured relief of a man who believed his extortion had worked. He immediately suggested I come by his house that evening, eager to close the circuit and secure his proxy. I countered the offer. I explained that my logistics firm had scheduled me for an off-site data compliance seminar in downtown Minneapolis for the entire afternoon. I suggested we meet at the executive suites I had rented in the financial district. I framed it as a convenience, noting that the building provided an on-demand notary service to ensure all the bank paperwork was executed by the book. He agreed without hesitation. The prospect of an on-site notary blinded him to the shift in geography. He was too focused on the finish line to realize I had just stripped him of his home field advantage. He was no longer operating from the patriarchal safety of his home office or the isolating depths of the cedar cabin. He was stepping into a sterile corporate arena where emotional manipulation holds zero currency. I arrived at the executive suite a full hour early to secure the environment. The conference room sat on the 34th floor of a glass and steel high-rise offering a panoramic view of the frozen Mississippi River winding through the city. The sky outside was a brilliant, unforgiving white. Inside the room was a masterclass in acoustic dampening and professional intimidation. A long, polished walnut table dominated the space, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. There were no family photographs to leverage for guilt. There were no roaring fireplaces to cast distracting shadows. There was only the brutal fluorescent clarity of a boardroom. I arranged my leather tote bag on the chair next to me. I placed a crystal pitcher of iced water and 3 glasses in the center of the walnut table. Then I sat down and waited. David and Harper arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. They walked through the glass double doors of the suite, wearing the smug, relaxed expressions of predators who believed the hunt was over. My father wore a tailored camel overcoat and a silk tie projecting the image of a successful commercial broker. He carried a slim leather folio, no doubt containing instructions for the bank transfer he planned to initiate the moment my signature hit the paper. Harper trailed a half step behind him, wrapped in a voluminous alpaca wool scarf. Her previous panic at the Sunday dinner and her shrill desperation at the lake cabin had evaporated entirely. She looked radiant, buoyed by the certainty that her vanity project was about to receive an $80,000 infusion. She had probably spent the morning drafting emails to her suppliers promising imminent payment. They took their seats across from me. My father unbuttoned his overcoat, draping it carefully over the back of his chair. He offered a warm, magnanimous smile, the kind a victor bestows upon a defeated opponent. He praised the view from the window, making trivial small talk about the downtown traffic and the plunging temperatures. He was performing, drawing out the moment to savor his perceived triumph. Harper placed her designer handbag on the table, pulled out her phone, and began scrolling, adopting an air of casual boredom. She could not even be bothered to pretend she cared about the medical proxy I was supposedly signing. She just wanted the cash cleared. I did not reach into my tote bag. I did not produce the legal packet. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, observing the two of them with the detached curiosity of a researcher watching a predictable chemical reaction. My father cleared his throat, signaling the end of the pleasantries. He tapped his fingers on the walnut veneer and asked if I had brought the paperwork. He adopted a gentle, encouraging tone, reassuring me that this step would alleviate so much pressure from my daily routine. He promised that once the consolidation was finished, we could focus entirely on my healing. I leaned forward and picked up the crystal pitcher. I poured a glass of water for my father, then one for my sister, and finally one for myself. The sound of the ice clinking against the glass was the only noise in the soundproofed room. I set the pitcher down. The heating system in the high-rise hummed faintly. The contrast between the freezing air outside and the climate-controlled warmth of the boardroom caused a reaction on the surface of the crystal. I watched a single bead of condensation form near the rim of my father's glass. It swelled, gathered weight, and began a slow, erratic descent down the curved side. It traced a wet path through the frosted surface, catching the overhead light before pooling silently onto the dark wood of the coaster. The room was perfectly, unbearably silent. I looked up from the glass and met my father's expectant gaze. I kept my voice crisp and devoid of any familial warmth. I told him I had brought the paperwork. I told him I had reviewed every single clause, every financial authorization, and every medical proxy stipulation. Harper let out a quiet, impatient sigh, dropping her phone onto the table. She told me to just sign the pages so we could all get on with our lives. She muttered that the theatrics were unnecessary. I smiled at her. It was not a sisterly smile. It was the smile of a trap springing shut. I turned my attention back to the man sitting across from me. I explained that since the documents fundamentally altered the administration of my healthcare and the distribution of my assets, I wanted to ensure the execution was flawless. I told him that transferring that level of authority required a strict adherence to protocol. Therefore, I had taken the liberty of inviting a specialized witness to oversee the signing. My father frowned. A flicker of unease crossed his features, disrupting the confident facade. He asked what kind of witness I was talking about, reminding me that the building already provided a standard notary. He shifted in his leather chair, his hand instinctively reaching for the slim folio he had brought. I did not answer his question. I did not need to. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the conference room clicked open. The sound echoed off the glass walls, sharp and definitive. David and Harper turned their heads in unison. Evelyn Croft stepped over the threshold. She wore a structured navy suit and carried a thick legal-bound folder under her left arm. She did not look like a standard building notary. She looked like a financial executioner. She closed the oak doors behind her with a solid thud, sealing the three of us inside the room. She walked toward the walnut table, her heels clicking a steady, relentless rhythm against the hardwood floor. The smugness evaporated from my father's face in an instant, replaced by the pale, rigid shock of a man who realized the ground had just vanished beneath his feet. The wait was over. It was time to present the data. Evelyn Croft did not offer a handshake. She moved to the head of the walnut table with the silent, deliberate grace of a seasoned litigator. She placed one thick forest green folder directly in front of my father. She placed the second folder in front of my sister. David stared at the heavy cardstock. His hand, which had been resting near his own leather folio, slowly withdrew, retreating to his lap. The confident flush in his cheeks began to recede, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. I stood up from my ergonomic chair. I did not lean on the table for support. The phantom ache in my shoulder, a constant companion during my autoimmune flares, was entirely gone. I was no longer operating in the murky emotional waters of family dynamics. I was standing in a boardroom executing a forensic post-mortem. I picked up a small remote from the center console and pressed a button. A motorized projector screen descended from the ceiling, sliding down to obscure the panoramic view of the frozen river outside. The room dimmed. The overhead projector clicked, humming to life with a low, mechanical whir. I connected my secure tablet to the display dock. A crisp, high-definition image illuminated the dark room. It was the photograph I had taken in his home office. The ivory paper resting on the polished desk blotter. The brass lamp casting a halo over the text. I kept my voice in the same modulated objective octave I use when presenting supply chain analytics to corporate stakeholders. I directed their attention to the screen. I read the header aloud, identifying the document as the Second Amendment to the Callaway Supplemental Needs Trust. I clicked a button, zooming in on Article 4, Section B. The text filled the screen, stark and undeniable. I read the altered contingent beneficiary clause word for word. I let the phrase outright and free of trust to David Harrison hang in the silent air. I pointed a laser indicator at the fresh notary seal and the inked signature at the bottom of the page. My father stopped breathing. His chest froze. His eyes darted from the illuminated screen to Evelyn Croft, then finally to me. The polished, benevolent patriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered predator calculating the distance to the nearest exit. He opened his mouth, stammering a fractured sentence. He tried to claim it was merely a draft, a theoretical exercise suggested by an outside consultant to optimize our tax liabilities. He forced a hollow, rattling laugh, suggesting I had grossly misinterpreted a piece of discarded scrap paper. I did not argue with his lie. You do not argue with a corrupted variable. You simply overwrite it with verifiable data. I tapped the tablet screen. The projected image shifted. The forged amendment disappeared, replaced by the data visualization timeline I had built in my home office. The chart was a stark color-coded rendering of his fiduciary history. I explained the methodology. I pointed to the flat, predictable green baseline stretching across the bottom of the axis, representing the legitimate medical disbursements used for my specialists and biologic infusions. Then I highlighted the jagged crimson spikes marching across the timeline. I detailed the rhythmic automated clearinghouse withdrawals of $2,500 executed on the 15th of every single month for 36 consecutive months. I projected the total sum onto the center of the screen. $90,000. I tapped the screen a third time. The final slide materialized. It was the public registry filing from the Minnesota Secretary of State. It displayed the incorporation documents for Apex Consulting Holdings. It listed the commercial routing number that received the stolen monthly disbursements. It listed his home address. It listed his name as the sole registered agent. The silence in the boardroom was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating. The air pressure in the room seemed to shift. Harper stared at the screen, her lips parted in genuine shock. For a brief second, she looked like she was trying to solve a complex math equation. She looked at the crimson spikes, then at the name of the shell company, and then at our father. The realization washed over her features. The miraculous $80,000 cash injection he had promised to save her failing lifestyle brand was not coming from a hidden real estate venture. It was coming from the exact same account he was already bleeding dry. The money she felt so entitled to was illegal. Taking it would make her an accessory to embezzlement. Her designer handbag suddenly looked very heavy on the table. David gripped the armrests of his leather chair. The knuckles on his hands turned white. A thin sheen of perspiration broke out across his forehead, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The irrefutable paper trail stripped away every defense mechanism he had relied on for decades. He could not gaslight a bank ledger. He could not charm a state registry document. He leaned forward, changing tactics. The arrogance dissolved into a frantic, pleading desperation. He lowered his voice, adopting the wounded tone of a martyr. He told me I did not understand the immense financial pressure he was under. He spun a narrative about the collapsing commercial real estate market, the crushing weight of his mortgage, and the sheer cost of keeping our family afloat. He raised his hands, palms outward, in a gesture of surrender. He looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes and said he only borrowed the money to protect our legacy. He claimed he did it for the family, assuring me he always intended to pay it back once his commissions recovered. I cut him off. My voice sliced through his performance with surgical precision. I told him the data did not support his narrative. A man intending to repay a loan does not forge a beneficiary clause to ensure he receives a payout upon his daughter's death. He did not act out of protection. He acted out of a calculated predatory greed, betting that my chronic illness would keep me too fatigued to audit the ledger. I reminded him where we were. We were in Minnesota. I recited the fiduciary statutes Evelyn and I had prepared. I informed him that under the jurisdiction of the state probate court, his biological relationship to me was entirely irrelevant. The court does not recognize a desperate father trying to save his family. The court only recognizes a sworn trustee who violated his oath. I told him he had committed gross self-dealing and fraud against a vulnerable beneficiary. I explained that his actions were not a family misunderstanding. They were a statutory crime. I reached into the leather tote bag resting on the chair beside me. I pulled out the crisp, watermarked petition for his immediate involuntary suspension. I slid the document across the polished walnut table. It came to a stop mere inches from his trembling hands. I told him the document was an ex parte emergency petition already signed and ready to be filed with the fiduciary board the following morning. It demanded his permanent removal, the transfer of the trust to a corporate management firm, and the full restitution of the $90,000 from his personal retirement accounts. He stared at the petition as if it were a venomous snake. He opened his mouth to negotiate, to offer a settlement, to beg for a quiet resolution within the family. I looked him directly in the eye, my posture unyielding, and delivered the final metric. I told him I did not bring him to the financial district to debate the terms of his surrender. I brought him here to show him the cage he had built for himself. I stated clearly that this meeting was not a negotiation. It was a notification. The trap had closed, and the only choice left was how much damage he wanted to endure on the way down. The silence that followed my notification was brittle, stretched so tight it felt like the air in the conference room might fracture. Evelyn Croft stood at the head of the walnut table, her hands folded neatly over her portfolio, projecting the immovable weight of the Minnesota legal system. My father stared at the printed petition resting inches from his fingers. The crisp watermark of the legal firm caught the fluorescent overhead light. The first person to break the silence was not my father. It was Harper. She had spent her entire life insulated by his financial shielding. When she wrecked a car in high school, he bought her a new one. When she maxed out her credit cards in her 20s, he quietly zeroed the balances. She was conditioned to believe that whenever a crisis loomed, he would simply manifest the capital to fix it. The data projected on the boardroom screen had just dismantled her entire worldview. Harper looked at the crimson spikes on the forensic timeline, then down at her designer handbag, and finally at the pale, sweating man sitting next to her. The realization hit her with the physical force of a winter gale. There was no hidden real estate venture. There was no liquid capital waiting to rescue her boutique. The $80,000 he had promised her at Sunday dinner was tied up in a fraudulent scheme that had just been dragged into the harsh light of a corporate audit. Her posture shifted. The elegant, bored lifestyle influencer vanished. Harper slammed her hands flat against the table. The sudden noise made my father flinch, his shoulders jerking toward his ears. She did not express horror that he had stolen from my medical trust. She did not voice any moral outrage about the forged death benefit that incentivized my passing. Her anger was entirely self-centered and breathtakingly transactional. She turned on him, her voice escalating into a shrill, piercing pitch that echoed off the soundproofed glass walls. She demanded to know if the money was truly gone. She did not wait for his answer. She leaned closer to him, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure entitlement, and accused him of sabotaging her future. She screamed that her commercial landlord was locking the doors to her storefront on Friday morning. She reminded him that he had looked her in the eye, patted her hand over roasted salmon, and promised the funds were secure. She called him a liar. She called him useless. The illusion of our loving, united family disintegrated in real time. The unbreakable bond between the noble patriarch and his golden child shattered, revealing the hollow, parasitic reality beneath. Harper loved him only as long as he could fund her curated aesthetic. The moment the bank account closed, her affection evaporated into pure hostility. David tried to shush her. He reached out, attempting to place a calming hand on her arm, falling back on his usual paternal conditioning. Harper slapped his hand away with a sharp smack. She stood up, her leather chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She paced the length of the boardroom, her expensive alpaca scarf slipping from her shoulders and dragging across the carpet. She hurled accusations at him, recounting every financial mistake he had made over the last decade, tearing down his ego piece by piece. She mocked his declining real estate commissions. She mocked the leased vehicle he drove to project false wealth to his colleagues. She stripped him of his dignity in front of his attorney and his youngest daughter. He sat there absorbing the verbal blows, shrinking into the upholstery of his chair. The man who had commanded hospital exam rooms and neighborhood block parties was reduced to a panicked, cornered animal. When he realized Harper could not be reasoned with, the full weight of his legal exposure finally crushed the breath out of him. The screaming daughter pacing the room was a symptom, but the petition on the table was a terminal diagnosis. David turned his attention back to me. The arrogance was gone. The fake benevolence was gone. He looked at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, his chest heaving under his cashmere sweater. He bypassed anger and descended straight into bargaining. He begged. He leaned across the walnut veneer, his voice trembling and thin. He pleaded with me to keep the dispute inside the family. He invoked the sacred unspoken rules of our Minnesota community. He reminded me how tight-knit our suburb was, how quickly rumors spread through the local chambers of commerce and the church congregations. He painted a vivid picture of the social ruin that would follow if Evelyn Croft filed the petition with the fiduciary board. The local courts would publish the docket. The regional banking officers would see the embezzlement flags. The neighbors who had brought us casseroles and prayed for my health would discover that he had been skimming my survival fund to pay his country club dues. He told me the shame would destroy him. In a state that prides itself on deep community care and protecting the vulnerable, being exposed as a predator who robbed his chronically ill daughter would render him a pariah. He said his career as a commercial broker would be over. His licenses revoked, his reputation turned to ash. He reached out his fingers, hovering inches from the crystal water pitcher, shaking visibly. He offered to draft a promissory note right then and there. He promised to repay every single cent of the $90,000 if I would just take the petition off the table. He swore he would sell his assets, liquidate his retirement accounts, and find a way to make the trust whole, provided I kept the authorities out of it. He appealed to my compassion, reminding me that I had always been the quiet, reasonable daughter. He tried to weaponize my own calm demeanor against me, assuming that because I disliked conflict, I would instinctively shield him from public humiliation. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair. I did not speak. I did not nod. I did not offer a single micro-expression of sympathy. I watched the two people who had planned to profit from my death tear each other apart over the ashes of their scheme. Harper was still pacing near the glass walls, hyperventilating, realizing her boutique was dead and her inventory was about to be seized by creditors. David was practically weeping over the polished wood, begging the sick daughter he had severely underestimated to save him from a jail cell. In my professional life, when a predictive model identifies a critical system failure, you do not intervene to stop the crash. You let the faulty code execute so you can document the exact point of collapse to ensure the next iteration is structurally sound. I was watching the collapse of the Harrison family architecture. They had built their lives on the assumption that my chronic illness made me weak and disposable. They had engineered a future where my value was measured only by my absence. Now the math had caught up with them. The variables they thought they controlled had executed a flawless countermeasure. Evelyn Croft remained standing at the head of the table, an immovable sentinel of accountability. She did not interrupt my father's pleading. She simply looked at her wristwatch, a silent ticking reminder that the billing hour was running and the legal machinery was already fueled and ready to launch. My father ran out of breath. His frantic promises faded into a pathetic, ragged silence. He looked at me, his face slick with sweat, waiting for the lifeline he felt he was inherently owed. He expected me to cave. He expected the quiet girl who always fixed his router and smiled through his medical gaslighting to step in and save him one last time. I let the silence stretch for 10 excruciating seconds. I let him feel the exact temperature of the room. I let him fully understand that the social currency he valued more than my life was currently trading at zero. The emotional audit was over, and the time for negotiation had expired. I unclasped my hands, resting them flat against the cool surface of the table, ready to deliver the final terms of his surrender. I watched my father gasp for air in the climate-controlled boardroom. His panicked pleas hung in the sterile space, waiting for a pardon I had no intention of granting. I unclasped my hands and placed them flat against the cool surface of the walnut table. I told him to stop talking. My voice did not echo, but it carried enough weight to snap his jaw shut instantly. I leaned forward, capturing his frantic gaze. I informed him that I was not going to call the county prosecutor. I was not going to file a police report, and I was not going to drag his reputation through a public criminal trial. A fleeting shadow of profound relief washed over his sweaty features. He mistook my pragmatism for forgiveness. He thought the quiet, accommodating daughter had returned to shield him from the consequences of his own greed. I corrected that assumption immediately. I explained that my decision had nothing to do with familial loyalty or lingering affection. Criminal trials require depositions, cross-examinations, and years of bureaucratic delays. They drain physical energy, and managing my autoimmune condition requires strict energy conservation. Every hour spent in a courtroom is an hour stolen from my recovery. In data science, you optimize for the most efficient outcome. Vengeance is a prolonged, messy algorithm. I told him I was granting him amnesty strictly out of a desire for my own unbroken peace. However, I clarified that my mercy carried an iron price, and the invoice was due right now. Evelyn Croft stepped forward, sliding a new stack of documents across the table. They were not court petitions. They were binding, irrevocable agreements drafted with lethal precision. I instructed my father to look at the first page. It was a formal, immediate resignation of his duties as trustee of the Callaway Supplemental Needs Trust. I told him he was going to sign it today, relinquishing every ounce of control he held over my medical safety net. He stared at the signature line, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic rhythms. I then directed his attention to the second document. It was a legally enforceable promissory note carrying the weight of a court-ordered judgment. I detailed the repayment terms. He had exactly 60 days to return the $90,000 he had siphoned through his phantom consulting firm. I did not care how he sourced the capital. I suggested he liquidate his personal retirement portfolios, sell his luxury leased vehicle, or put a second mortgage on his sprawling suburban home. The mechanics of his financial ruin were his problem to solve. I told him that if the funds were not deposited into the trust account by the 60th day, Evelyn would execute the original petition and hand the forensic timeline directly to the district attorney. He was buying his freedom, and the cost was his entire retirement cushion. He picked up the silver pen, his fingers trembling so severely he could barely grip the metal barrel. He asked who would manage the trust if he resigned, grasping for a final sliver of influence in a desperate bid to maintain some illusion of authority. I painted a vivid picture of his replacement. I told him the funds were being transferred to a premier corporate fiduciary firm, headquartered in downtown Minneapolis. The new trustee would not be a sympathetic family member susceptible to emotional manipulation or Sunday dinner guilt trips. It would be a faceless, hyper-efficient corporate entity. They operate solely on algorithms, statutory compliance, and rigid state fiduciary law. They require itemized receipts for every medical expenditure. They conduct routine, unannounced audits. They do not accept boutique coffee bribes, and they do not care about his reputation at the local country club. I informed him that he would never be able to touch influence or even view the ledger ever again. He was permanently locked out of the financial architecture my grandmother had built to keep me alive. The safety net was finally secure, guarded by a machine that could not be charmed, threatened, or deceived. Harper had retreated to the far corner of the boardroom, her back pressed against the soundproof glass overlooking the frozen river. She was clutching her designer handbag like a flotation device. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating her curated bubble. She realized the $90,000 my father was being forced to repay was the exact sum she needed to rescue her failing lifestyle brand. The bridge loan he had promised her was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She opened her mouth, her voice a reedy, desperate whisper, asking what was supposed to happen to her boutique. I turned my head and looked at my older sister. For years, she had viewed my chronic illness as an unfortunate limitation that somehow justified her sense of financial entitlement. She believed her able-bodied ambition entitled her to my survival fund, treating my life as a lesser existence meant to subsidize her aesthetics. I spoke to her with the gentle, unyielding finality of a judge delivering a verdict. I told her she was going to get nothing. The bank would seize her storefront by the end of the week. Her inventory of imported candles and linen aprons would be liquidated for pennies. She would have to file for commercial bankruptcy and rebuild her life using her own resources just like any other business owner who failed to balance their ledgers. I watched the realization crush the remaining breath from her lungs. The golden child was officially cut off from the treasury. She had spent her entire adult life insulated by stolen money, and now she was being evicted into the cold reality of consequence. My father lowered his head, the remaining fight draining out of him. The undeniable paper trail had boxed him into a corner with no viable exits. The charm offensive had failed. The threats had failed. He was stripped bare, reduced to a man holding a pen over a document that documented his own disgrace. He uncapped the silver pen. The metal scratched loudly against the heavy cardstock in the silent room. He signed the immediate resignation, severing his legal ties to my life. He turned the page and signed the binding restitution agreement, legally obligating himself to drain his own future to repay what he had stolen from mine. His signature, usually a bold, sweeping declaration of patriarchal confidence, was reduced to a jagged, pathetic scrawl. He pushed the documents across the walnut table, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his face drained of all color and pride. He looked like a man who had just attended his own funeral and was forced to pay for the casket. Evelyn Croft leaned over and inspected the signatures, verifying the ink and the placement. She nodded once, a sharp gesture of legal confirmation that sealed the trap shut forever. I reached across the expansive table and retrieved the signed papers. I pulled a clear plastic sleeve from my leather tote bag and slid the documents inside, sealing the crisp pages away from the ambient humidity of the room. The smooth slide of the plastic was the only sound in the boardroom. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my wool coat. I looked down at the two broken figures sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit space. My entire life they had used a very specific ruler to measure my worth. They had defined my value by my illness, my quietness, and my perceived utility to their social and financial ambitions. They believed I was fragile enough to rob and silent enough to accept it. I looked my father directly in his bloodshot eyes, and then I looked at my sister shivering against the glass. I told them I had just fixed their ruler. I did not wait for an apology. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy oak doors. My footsteps echoed with calm, measured precision across the hardwood floor. I opened the doors, stepped out into the bustling, anonymous hallway of the corporate high-rise, and left them trapped in the silent, suffocating ruins of their own greed. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the downtown boardroom clicked shut behind me. The brutal Minnesota winter finally broke, yielding to a vibrant green summer. The thick ice on the local lakes melted into dark blue glass, and a profound transformation occurred in my own biology alongside the changing of the seasons. Without the suffocating presence of my father hovering in exam rooms, without his practiced sighs and deliberate medical gaslighting amplifying my daily anxiety, the chronic inflammation in my joints began to recede. Stress is a notorious trigger for autoimmune flare-ups. By severing the primary source of my psychological tension, I inadvertently prescribed myself the most effective treatment I had ever received. My morning stiffness vanished entirely. My blood panels returned with metrics so healthy my rheumatologist actually smiled during our last consultation. I no longer required the elevated steroid doses my father had eagerly lobbied for to maintain his tragic narrative. I was living proof that sometimes the disease is not entirely in your cells. Sometimes the disease is the person claiming to cure you. The financial architecture of my life is now governed by an institution that possesses zero emotional capacity. The premier corporate management firm operates out of a sleek, unfeeling building in the financial district. The new trustee does not send me text messages demanding Sunday dinner attendance in exchange for medical approvals. They do not require a tearful performance of gratitude or a public display of my physical limitations. They only require uploaded receipts in a standardized digital format. I log into a secure encrypted portal, submit my clinical invoices, and a sterile algorithm processes the reimbursement within 48 hours. The clinical efficiency is beautiful. My grandmother designed the Callaway Supplemental Needs Trust to be a silent, invisible shield protecting me from the unpredictable ravages of a chronic illness. My father turned it into an extortion racket. The corporate fiduciaries restored its original purpose. They guard the ledger with statutory rigidity, ensuring that every cent is directed toward my stability. The $320,000 balance remains untouched by predatory hands quietly accruing interest under the watchful eye of a machine. The 60-day deadline I set for the restitution payment did not pass quietly. My father tried to find a loophole. He attempted to secure high-risk commercial loans, leveraged his waning real estate contacts, and exhausted every remaining favor he held in the Twin Cities. The math was inescapable, and the threat of Evelyn Croft walking the forensic evidence into the district attorney's office hung over his head like an anvil. On the 58th day, a cashier's check for $90,000 was deposited directly into the corporate trust account. The capital did not materialize out of thin air. It required a sacrifice he never intended to make, to satisfy the debt and keep himself out of a state penitentiary. David was forced to list the family lake cabin. The sprawling cedar and riverstone retreat, the crown jewel of his carefully curated social identity, went on the open market at a steep discount to secure a rapid cash sale. I saw the real estate listing online. The digital photographs highlighted the soaring stone fireplace where he had cornered me and threatened to abandon my medical care. A technology executive from Chicago bought the property in cash, intending to tear down the historic structure and build a modern minimalist compound. The loss of the cabin devastated my father's standing in our tight-knit suburban community. He could no longer host the lavish summer retreats that cemented his status among the local elite. The sudden, desperate liquidation of his prized assets sparked relentless whispers at his Rotary Club meetings and hushed speculative conversations at the country club. The neighborhood did not know the exact details of the fiduciary embezzlement, but they recognized the undeniable scent of financial ruin. The benevolent patriarch facade crumbled, replaced by the grim reality of a man quietly drowning in his own consequences. His social currency evaporated, leaving him isolated in the suburbs he used to rule. Harper fared no better under the unforgiving weight of the real world. Without the $80,000 injection she felt she inherently deserved, Lumina and Loam collapsed within a single month. Her commercial landlord changed the locks on her boutique storefront, leaving a bright orange eviction notice taped to the pristine glass door. Her carefully curated inventory of imported beeswax candles and raw silk aprons was auctioned off to a generic liquidator to cover her outstanding freight invoices. Her lifestyle brand's social media presence went dark, the aesthetic illusion shattered by genuine insolvency. The last I heard through the familial grapevine, my older sister had secured a junior marketing position at a regional insurance firm. She now sits in a cubicled office under fluorescent lights, reports to a manager 5 years her junior, and navigates rush-hour traffic to earn a standardized salary. She was forced to abandon the golden child narrative and join the working class she used to view with such disdain. The universe has a remarkable sense of irony when distributing its corrective measures, stripping her of the unearned luxury she tried to fund with my survival money. I sit on the balcony of my St. Paul townhouse, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The evening air is warm and smells of blooming lilac. I sip a glass of iced tea, feeling the steady, painless rhythm of my own pulse. My family looked at my physical condition and saw a weakness they could exploit. They measured my worth by my fatigue and calculated my value based on a forged death benefit. They assumed that because I favored quiet analysis over loud confrontation, I would simply absorb their theft to keep the peace. They failed to understand a fundamental principle of data science. The quietest systems are usually the ones processing the most lethal equations. When people treat your calmness as a deficiency, they grant you the ultimate tactical advantage. They speak freely. They leave their ledgers open on their desks. They hand you the exact coordinates of their vulnerabilities. They are always shocked when you gather their discarded data points, compile them into an inescapable snare, and use their own arrogance to build a cage around them. I did not raise my voice in the exam room, at the Sunday dinner, or in the corporate boardroom. I let the documentation speak for me. I fixed the ruler they used to measure my life, and I broke their empire without breaking a sweat. This brings us to the end of another broadcast on Orange Vengeance. I want to turn the focus over to you. The world is full of people who will try to redraw your borders to expand their own territory. What is the one boundary you refuse to let anyone cross? Tell me about the moment you stopped accepting their narrative and started writing your own consequences. Leave your story in the comments below. Your victory might be the exact blueprint someone else needs to secure their own freedom. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more stories coming about underestimated women who quietly took back their power. Until next time, stay sharp, trust your own data, and never apologize for protecting your peace.
We often build our families the same way we build our houses, presenting a flawless manicured facade to the street while ignoring the foundation cracking quietly in the dark. In the American suburbs, where holiday greeting cards and carefully curated social media feeds project a relentless ideal of unity, it becomes dangerously easy to confuse public reputation with private devotion. The story of Clara and her father David is more than a satisfying sequence of legal checkmates. It serves as a profound mirror reflecting the hidden fractures in our modern parenting values, challenging us to examine the true cost of raising children in a culture that frequently prioritizes status over soul. At the heart of this narrative lies a pervasive societal illness, the weaponization of the ego and the tragedy of transactional love. We live in an era where social currency often dictates self-worth. David played the role of the tragic, sacrificing caretaker to perfection. He traded his daughter's chronic illness for sympathy, standing in hospital corridors and neighborhood block parties, absorbing the pity of onlookers like oxygen. He used Clara not as a child to be nurtured, but as a prop to elevate his own moral standing in the community. Meanwhile, his older daughter Harper embodied a love conditional on financial convenience, viewing family ties strictly through the lens of material gain. Clara was reduced to a resource, a ledger entry waiting to be cashed out. This dynamic forces us to confront a difficult question about family responsibility. When we raise our children, are we nurturing independent spirits, or are we cultivating investments? To break this toxic cycle and raise families grounded in genuine connection, the story points toward a necessary internal reckoning rooted in three core pillars: wisdom, morality, and resilience. And wisdom in the context of parenting begins with a harsh awakening. It requires the clarity to recognize that children are not property. They are not extensions of our own egos, nor are they second chances to fulfill our abandoned dreams. They are autonomous lives demanding respect and autonomy. David lacked this fundamental wisdom. He calculated that he could outsmart consequence rewriting a trust document under the assumed premise that a sick daughter would be too weak to notice the theft. Clara conversely wielded wisdom like a scalpel. She did not react with blind resentment or tearful outrage. She retreated into silence, using observation and logic to pierce through the deception. Wisdom is seeing the board clearly before making a move. It is the understanding that true guidance means equipping a child to stand on their own rather than keeping them dependent to serve a caretaker's vanity. True morality extends far beyond outward displays of generosity. David purchased expensive boutique coffees for the nursing staff to cement his image as a devoted father. Yet behind closed doors, he forged a legal document that financially incentivized his daughter's early death. Morality is not a performance for an audience. It is the quiet, unseen commitment to protect the vulnerable. In a traditional family structure, parental love must remain selfless. It means giving without the expectation of a return on investment. When affection is laced with calculation, when a parent secretly views a child's demise as a pathway to a financial windfall, the moral compass shatters. The resulting fallout leaves a legacy of betrayal that no amount of money can repair. Honesty, emotional awareness, and fairness are not just concepts to teach children. They are the baseline requirements for a parent's own conscience. Then comes resilience, perhaps the hardest virtue to cultivate. For parents, resilience is the courage to face the darker parts of their own nature. It takes profound strength to admit to material greed, to acknowledge personal failures, and to resist projecting those insecurities onto the next generation. David and Harper chose the easy path, demanding Clara carry the weight of their financial incompetence rather than facing their own ruin. Clara demonstrated the highest form of resilience. We often mistake strength for volume. We assume power looks like shouting, controlling, or breaking things. Clara showed us that true power is stillness. Her resilience was her ability to set an ironclad boundary. She refused to participate in the toxic theater her family had staged. She gathered her data, secured her future, and boldly severed the ties that threatened her peace. She did not seek to destroy her father out of malice. She simply held up a mirror and forced him to face his own reflection. She walked away, proving that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop paying the toll on a bridge that leads nowhere. As parents, as siblings, and as members of a community, we must stop using the wrong rulers to measure the people we love. Bank balances, physical health, and social status are fragile metrics. They break under the weight of real tragedy. Genuine peace does not reside in a lakefront cabin funded by deceit, nor does it thrive in a business built on a sister's stolen safety net. It lives in a clear conscience. It survives in a home where no one has to sleep with one eye open, guarding their future against the people who are supposed to protect it. When parents love their children only for what they can extract from them, the final bill eventually comes due. The cost is a profound, echoing loneliness in the final chapters of their lives, spent counting the wealth they stole while sitting in an empty room. If Clara's quiet rebellion resonated with you, if you have ever had to draw a line in the sand to protect your own peace from the people who were supposed to be your safe harbor, you are not alone. Join our community and subscribe to Orange Vengeance. We continue to share the stories of those who refuse to be underestimated, turning their silence into strategy and reclaiming their power. We leave this story behind, but the questions it raises linger in the quiet moments of our own lives. Look closely at the dynamics playing out at your own dinner tables, in the hushed conversations in your hallways, and in the expectations placed upon the next generation. We all hold a ruler, measuring the worth of the people around us. The question remains when the day ends and the social masks slip away. What exactly are you measuring? And more importantly, who is keeping the score?